Chapter 16. The Olden Days. Gloria had had a bright idea. "I'm thinking of starting a newspaper in school," she said one day. "Are you?" I exclaimed, with immediate interest. "Yes," she replied. "It would sell like hot cakes." "Well," I said, "we shall have to be thinking about compositions." The previous year, the All Saints Mission School had produced a school newspaper, which had aroused much interest. "We could put in all the latest scandal," said Gloria gleefully. "Oh," I commented, with less enthusiasm. "Sure," she said. "You know the sort of thing. What was Stanley doing hanging around the bay, waiting for Susie?" "Well," I said, "I should prefer a more literary angle, but how often are you thinking of bringing it out?" "Once a month, maybe once a week," said Gloria. "Boy, we could make some money." "It would be an enormous task," said I. "How do you propose to reproduce it?" "You've got a typewriter," said Gloria. I exclaimed. "Sure," said Gloria. "You would be the editor." "Good heavens," I said. "How on earth do you think I could find time to produce a weekly newspaper, in addition to teaching and cleaning house, and cooking my meals, and washing and ironing, and visiting my pupils, and writing letters, and marking books, and preparing lessons?" Gloria was right in one way. A record was needed of the incidents which went to make up everyday life in the Arctic. The stories I had heard on Christmas night had put an edge to my appetite. I wanted more, and not only accounts of the white man's experiences. I longed to know what life had been like for the native before the coming of the white man. I had felt for some time that there was an artificiality in the way I was introducing learning to the native child, necessarily limited by my own experience. I was teaching English nursery rhymes and folk tales to the little ones, but what was the significance of such whimsies as "Who has been eating my porridge?" or "What big teeth you have, grandmother?" to children who were familiar with the real habits of bears and wolves? Might there not be a source of folk lore in tales told by the Indian and Eskimo grandmothers, on which I could draw to provide material for literary and dramatic work with my pupils, and which would prove a much more robust approach to learning for them? I decided to explore possible sources. Soon after I had made it known that I should be interested to hear old-time tales from residents of the area, I was visited by an old Indian named Johnny Simple, who thought his reminiscences might be worth $5 to me. This suggestion put me in a quandary. If I gave him money every time he brought a story, he would doubtless spin them out for a very long time. On the other hand, if he did have good material, I was prepared to pay for it. I pointed out to him that my aim in collecting stories was educational, that I wished to preserve the history and folklore of his race for the benefit of the present school children and their children, and invited him to cooperate in this. Thus encouraged, Johnny visited me from time to time, and recounted his reminiscences at length, and I began to get a deeper insight into the culture of the native people. Johnny told me he had heard his mother describe the coming of the first white man among the Mackenzie Delta Indians. At that time, there was an Indian village in the area now known as Fort McPherson, and another at Arctic Red River. The people of these two groups spoke a common language. In those days it was dangerous to wander away from the village, as the Eskimos would often sneak in from the coast to attack the Indians, who would in their turn set forth to maraud the Huskies. There was not much timber in this district, and when a large chip of wood was found floating farther upriver, there was much speculation as to its origin. Had it been gnawed by some big beaver? The chip was sent to McPherson, but the mystery was not solved until the next year, when a white man with his axe arrived in the settlement. He was brought in by a Slavi Indian who could converse with these people and make known that the white man came in peace, so there was no fighting. Everybody came to see the white man, and soon he announced that he was the boss and they were to trap furs for him. In return, he would provide them with the articles they now coveted. A mink skin, for instance, would buy 1 square file. Nowadays, the trader will pay $20 for one good skin, or pay them money with which they could buy the trader's goods. For 3 marten he would give 50 cents, for a red fox 50 cents, for a cross fox $1, and for a silver gray fox $2.50. How much fur must we bring for a gun? They asked. The white man indicated a pile of furs as tall as the length of the gun. The next time Johnny came to see me, he said he would tell me a Luchuk story about the boy in the moon. He settled in my easy chair and began. One winter, big band Indian around the wood. One married man, he got no child ever since a married, and both very old. Happen one time, old lady, she got little baby boy. Baby started to talk about 1 week old. People very interested. Baby where it come from, and not much a grub. Meat all gone, people starving, but 2 or 3 week. This kid, he says, I'll make a medicine. To his father. His father says, oh my kid, you too small. At last people, they make a fun of you. If I don't make medicine for caribou, well, people all starve to death, said the boy. And his father go out speechin' to the people about the kid, what he said. People, they very interested. People move that day, and kid, he says, the middle of the day. People stop and make good fire, but don't tramp snow, so I can walk round fire and people not see my track. That show you how wonderful kid I am. So people do what he say. Kid walk around fire and sing song. Put his little hand down in the snow and pulled out caribou head. Kid say, I got power to do this. Go ahead. You people go hunting today, and you see million a caribou. Kid says, if you kill many caribou, 1 caribou be fat, and you give to me that fat caribou. The kid told his father, you gonna pack me today, I'll show the people what I want. In those days, whenever bunch of caribou got killed, somebody come around, cut caribou head off. Caribou belonged to a man who cut the head off. His father packed the kid around, and kid found caribou he chose. A cruel man came along. He not pity on kid. He say, you're not wonderful kid. You think you're medicine man, this caribou mine. You're not going to get anything of it. Kid started crying, told his father, let's go home. All the way crying. When they got back to camp again, he's still crying. Some good person he tried to make Kid happy. He bring fat, but the kid wouldn't have it. Middle of the night, people all come back bringing some meat. Caribou head roasted, and people have very big time that night. Caribou head favorite Indian grub. Kid still crying. Cruel man go out his house, and he speechin' hard. This cruel man must be one of head men. He say, send to the moon this kid, because he keep us awake this night. Kid stopped crying. He told his father, I know, I understand what he's saying. Soon old lady and old man, getting tired and sleepy. Before he go to bed, Kitty say, you gonna see me in the moon generation one after another in this world. Don't be sorry for me. If I'm a-gone, don't be cry for me. Kid say, you got any caribou blood? In those days, the people always got caribou blood for make a soup. And this family got one dog. He told his mother, you bring in dog and tie down there. Now tonight gonna be happen with me, but I come back again. He asked his mother, what my father bring in, any meat? His mother told him, your father bring in one shoulder caribou. He asked, did you ever cut little piece out? Mother say, no boy, told his mother, you take clean white caribou, tanned hide, put meat inside, and wrap around meat. Every time you cut piece off that meat, clean skin and wrap up again. So that meat not be gone. Gonna be same again. That gonna keep you alive until in the famine gone. His mother do whatever kids say. Tomorrow people go out to haul in caribou, but all gone. Kid, he make a sign to go up to moon. He told his father goodbye. You see me till end of world in moon. The kid disappeared in night. In morning his pants, one side only, were hanging up in teepee opening. People look for him all over. Next night kid come back, told his mother and father, tell the people if he starving he worship me in moon. I'll make a word for you, sing song I make, with word inside, and singing, so I hear from the moon. Finally it happened that cruel leader and his band, they starved to death. Whole works. Only boy's mother and father live, by that shoulder. When the full moon in sight, look like man. One side he hold blood, one side dog. White man say mountains, but Indian know he kid in the moon. Johnny looked about 50, but he was nearer 70 years of age. He was born in a settlement further up the Peel River, and remembered how in 1898 a big band of gold miners, maybe 1,000 strong, came down the Mackenzie on their way to Dawson, some via the Red River, and some by way of the Peel. Johnny's elder brother, Simon, spoke a little English, but he did not understand paper money. A miner wanted to buy a dog, and Simon said, "All right, I'll sell you one good dog." The white man gave him a paper bill and said, "This is worth $100. The white man went over the mountain, and they never saw him again. But when Simon, on his return to McPherson, tried to spend his bill in the Hudson's Bay Company store, Post Manager Firth told him it was worth only $1. Simon was sorry for his dog. The next year, half the LeChuck's people set out to try to find the Klondike. Simon came in contact with a man named Peter, who told him that the city of Dawson was only 75 miles away, and that a good price would be paid for their meat. Simon spread the news among his people, and they all hunted moose and caribou, and set off for the city with 20-dog teams pulling loaded toboggans. In those days the Indians dressed in skin coats with caps of beaver or marten, and heavy blue serge pants with English sashes, sold by the bay. The dog harness was decorated with bells and tassels. On the way to Dawson, the LeChucks reached a village. Of a Yukon tribe, the Moosehide Indians, who thought they had come in war and ran to hide down the riverbank or behind the tents, carrying their guns. Spokesmen of the two tribes found they could not understand each other. They tried English. "Where you come from?" asked the Moosehide chief. "We Peel River Indians. Go visit Dawson," they replied. They were invited to stay overnight in the Moosehide teepees, and they enjoyed the hospitality, though they had a hard time understanding each other. The next morning their hosts lent them a couple of boys to show them the way. Johnny said there were 30,000 people along the trail and in the city of Dawson. When they came to the city, they met some miners who had traveled by way of McPherson and remembered the Peel River. Indians. They took charge of the LeChuck's lads, showing them the dance halls and the movie picture show. The boys soon sold all their meat at 50 cents a pound, and with the money bought a load of white man's grub to take home again. They took home also tall tales about the white man's dogs, as big as a moose, on which he rode about the country. They continued to trade in meat and fur with the hungry people in Dawson, and after a couple of years or so they left McPherson for good. One time in the fall, 2 Indians went down to Dawson with a dog pack. They found the people in the city sick, and left again a few days later. They took with them the seed of the sickness to their own people, and it spread from camp to camp. There was no doctor to minister to them, and they did not know what kind of strange sickness this was. All Johnny's brothers and sisters died of the smallpox. In time, Johnny became a deckhand on the river steamers traveling down the Yukon River from Dawson and Fairbanks to the Arctic Ocean. He used to visit the Russian station of St. Michael's. This was a little bit log house with 2 old-fashioned big guns. An old man told him a story of how at one time the Russians and the Alaska Indians made a little war on the Fairbanks River. One night the Indians sneaked round the Russian camp and cleaned up the Russians earlier in the morning. The Russian could not stand for that. He made a friend of the Indians, and soon afterwards he sold Alaska to the USA. In those days, said Johnny, the symbol of wealth and power was the possession of a large number of blankets. Sometimes a man would pay as much as 100 blankets to the family of the girl he wanted to marry. On the death of a great man, his relatives would work together to raise money for a potlatch. Bead and bone necklaces were the coin used to buy guns, clothes, and food to give away at the funeral feast. The guests invited from over a wide area would foregather at a spot 2 or 3 miles away and stay there overnight. Their host would send food out for them. At noon the next day the strangers came into the village, decorated with feathers and with their faces painted half red, half black. The mourners were similarly adorned. The red represented the crow, and the black the wolf. For a week on end the celebrations lasted. Fur and food was distributed among the visitors at a cost of the equivalent of maybe a couple of £100, and the feasting and dancing went on night and day. The friends of the deceased took part in a sing-song, in which they lauded his virtues and boasted of their own prodigality over his funeral, hoping that in future luck would bring them a good return for the money they had spent. I asked Johnny to tell me about the habits of the wild animals according to his own experience. He said he had lived in the woods, hunting and trapping, for 15 to 20 years. Once he walked through migrating caribou herds in one direction for 3 days on end. On one hill there would be as many as 500 animals. He reckoned that there would be 500,000 young ones in the herd. Grizzly bears and eagles killed many of the young. Wolves, he thought, left them alone because the calves were not fat enough to make a good meal. These caribou came over the mountains from Alaska into the Yukon, where they spent the winter, returning home again in the spring, traveling 400 or 500 miles. Another band traveled between Dawson and the Mackenzie River, following the same route every year, in a circle from Dawson via Porcupine River to Fort Norman. This band had a chance to multiply because there were very few humans in the area. Other caribou came from the Firth River district, spending most of their time in the mountains along the ocean and traveling only about 300 miles. The young were born in the valley of the Firth River, and when they were strong enough, the herd was on the move again. Moose were easily found round Hungry Lake, and the Blackstone, Wind, and Bonnet Plume rivers. The native people did not kill the cow moose in the spring, because then they have young ones, and their meat is poor. Johnny spoke of the marten with respect. "Am sure this animal got lots of sense," he said. "He figure ahead, and he remember. He know the weather. He lay up all his food in summertime." He was curious to know how many young ones the female could have, so one winter when he was trapping in the Yukon and got 74 marten, he cut some of the animals open to find out. He found that a 1-year-old mother would have 2 or 3 young, but an older one might have as many as 6. When rabbits and mice, which provide a food supply for the marten, are scarce, the adult marten will kill half its young. Incidentally, all the smaller animals in the north feed on mice and on lemmings. Even a jackfish will swallow swimming mice. The marten does not allow her babies out of the nesting hole for a couple of months. When they need meat in their diet, she will go out and bring home food she had previously cached. When Johnny was trapping, he once watched a marten come along to an open piece of ground and dive down through deep snow to bring up the remains of a rabbit which she must have killed the previous August, and drag half of it home to her little ones. On another occasion, he watched a fox in winter time come along the edge of a lake and dig fresh duck eggs out of a nigger head. It broke the eggs and licked them out, so they must have been fresh enough to be palatable. Beaver eat nothing but willow and waterweed, but the muskrat will sometimes eat fish. Mink catch lots of fish for the winter time. When food is short, they go up the mountains and travel in high places, feeding off rabbits and ptarmigan. Somebody had suggested to me that I ought to visit the hospitals in town and seek stories from the older patients. When I had been a member of the mission school staff, it had been part of my duty to tour the hospital wards from time to time to help to cheer up the patients. I had found this a most heart-rending duty. There were so many of them, all native people, Indians and Eskimos, and in all age groups, from babyhood upwards. On my first visit, one young mother had told me with longing of her 3 beautiful children, from whom she had been parted for some years. Her bed was beside the window, and the bright spot of her day was the moment when she could wave to her children as they passed below on the way to church, or on the daily walk. In the wards, the roguish 3- and 4-year-olds knew at least one English word, candy, and as I stood by their beds, they clamored for it, and for the bright pictures composed of old Christmas cards, which the children in my class made for them. The young girls, with their silky black tresses studded with hair slides in gay colors, were as glamour-conscious as their more fortunate sisters. Some of them would be occupied with beadwork on bow-shaped looms, or busy embroidering mucklucks for their boy friends. The Eskimo women would be weaving tapsus girdles on as many as 150 multicolored stands tied from the rail at the foot of the bed to their waists. In the men's wards, the young fellows strummed their guitars or played cribbage with their visiting friends. Visiting was allowed every evening, and the old men lay looking at the ceiling, their faces wrinkling into childlike smiles when you offered them a cigarette. And in every ward there would be a background of music from the soft cowboy lyrics of the much-loved request programs broadcast from CHAK. The hospital matron thought that Mary Niondo would be able to tell me some stories, and I was taken to be introduced. I found Mary in a little ward, with only two companions, Lucy Rat and Ada Stewart. Mary and Lucy spoke only the Luchuk's language, but Ada had enough facility with English to be able to act as interpreter. It turned out that Mary was Johnny Simple's half-sister, and from the wealth of stories she had at the tip of her tongue, I concluded that perhaps her family had been the traditional storytellers of the tribe. I found it a stimulating experience to sit in the little room with my pencil poised while the liquid words trickled from Mary's hardly moving lips, and her companions hung on the story, generally convulsed with laughter at the escapades she was describing. I must, perforce, wait for the translation. It was most intriguing to watch Mary's gestures and try to anticipate the interpretation. Snug and warm in the lighted room, though the moisture of our breathing formed thick ice on the window panes. Lucy would sit cross-legged on her bed in white flannel nightgown and wearing black stockings, with a black scarf round her head. Ada was a young woman, and must have been handsome before the disease attacked her. Mary, sweet-faced, brown, and wrinkled, was always eager to tell a story, though sometimes she did not feel well enough to sit up. Sometimes the plot of a story wound on and on in an endless succession of incidents, and I could not catch hold of the thread which would disentangle it. In that event, I just went on writing, and hoped that on reading what I had written, I should be able to detect the climax, but perhaps I was wrong in trying to convert to our own pattern stories, which had been devised as serials, to while away the long hours of darkness. Perhaps no climax was needed, as in the story of the two giants, Big Mosquito and Sky High. Big Mosquito and Sky High were two giants, who were hereditary enemies. First, one would get a band of lesser men around him, and go and attack the other, and then his victim would retaliate. It was now the turn of Sky High to wreak vengeance. So he went in search of an accomplice. He met a big man who he thought would do for his purpose, but the man was so scared of the giant that he crawled into a porcupine's hole. Sky High just rolled a rock to the doorway of the hole, and threatened that if the man did not come out, he would leave the rock there and let him starve to death. The man tried to push away the stone, but found this beyond his strength. So scared of starving to death, he called out, "Take away the stone, grandfather, and I will come out." Sky High took away the stone, and out came the man. "My grandchild," said Sky High, "my enemy, Big Mosquito, has had a fight with me and killed lots of my friends. I want you to be on my side when I fight him." Then, instructing his new friend to follow him, he set out to find Big Mosquito, but alas, his strides outdistanced those of the lesser man, so rapidly that this one called out, "Grandfather, wait for me." Sky High turned back, picked the fellow up, and put him in his pocket. By and by they came to a big lake that was full of fish. On the far side of the lake they could see Big Mosquito fishing. Sky High took the man out of his pocket and said to him, "My grandchild, I have a plan. You shall go to the other side of the lake, pretending to be a fox. Big Mosquito is afraid of foxes, so you make a noise like a fox, and when Big Mosquito tries to run away, jump on him and cut the tendons at the back of his neck with your teeth. Then he will not be able to move." The man changed himself into a fox and started to cross the lake on the ice. Big Mosquito heard the crackling of the ice, but he did not turn around. He thought it was Tanveste, the ice fooling him. Sky High worked his way round the lake shore, and on the way he picked himself a stout log for a club. When he came up to Big Mosquito, immobilized by the fox, he hit him over the head with the club and killed him. Next, they had to reckon with the giant's wife, who had heard the roars of her husband and came running to protect him. Sky High gave her a tap with the log and killed her too. The giant now thanked the man who had helped him and told him he was free to go home. He offered him his staff to help him on his way, but it was too big for the man to manage, so Sky High cut off a sliver to be his walking stick. Now the stick had magic properties, and the giant told him that every night he must put the stick upright in the ground, and then he must climb to the top of a tree and roost like a bird. Since the giant's dogs were all loose in the forest and might eat him up, in the morning Sky High said, "You will find that the stick has fallen and is pointing in a certain direction. You must follow that path each day, and you will at last come back to your own people." Sky High had one more instruction for him. If he should meet the dogs, he must call out, "Grandfather, I am afraid of your dogs. They are all around me." The man did just as he had been told. Every night he put the stick upright in the ground, and then climbed to a tree, tying himself to the topmost branches. Every morning he followed the direction indicated by the fallen stick. Then one night he awoke and heard animals growling. His tree was surrounded by animals of all kinds, leaping up and trying to chew the tree down. He called out, "My grandfather, I am scared of your dogs. They are all around me." Sky High heard him and called his dogs by name, and they all disappeared in one streak. The next morning the stick had fallen, so that it was pointing backwards. So the man knew that his people had moved in the opposite direction. He went that way, and by saw an old woman coming towards him. She turned out to be his mother, and they were very pleased to see each other. But she had bad news for him. "My son," she said, "after you left, your wife married a marten. It is time you came home again." He went home with his mother, and sat next to his wife. The marten ran about the camp, not knowing what to do. When the man saw the marten, he took a lump of fat and threw it. This hit the marten in the face. Blood poured out of his nose, and he ran off into the bush and never came back again. Mary had, besides these tales of giants and magic, other kinds of stories, some of which were obviously fables. I was surprised to find that this primitive northern race used the same method as the ancient Greeks to impress moral values on their children. The stories about the wolverine especially struck me. They seemed to be designed to teach the young not to let others impose on them. For instance, a man who had been much bothered by marauding wolves decided to make a cache where the animals would find it too much trouble to get at his supplies. There was a tree leaning horizontally from the top of a steep river bank, at the foot of which the beach was covered with stones. He balance-walked out to the branches at the end of the trunk and built his stage there, storing on it his snowshoes, fish line, babiche, rawhide thongs, and skin tent, as well as meat and other food. Then he went off to hunt. When he was well out of the way of the wolves, they came prowling back. They smelt the meat, and they tried to get at it. But the climb along the leaning tree was too much for them, so they went down to the beach and looked up at the cache with their mouths drooling. They saw the wolverine coming, and their hopes rose again. The wolverine is a smart animal. He can climb and he can jump. He can even get into a beaver camp. So they asked the wolverine to get the meat down for them. The wolverine was flattered at being asked. He wanted to show what a fine jumper he was. He gave a mighty leap, but did not reach the tree. "Try again," said the wolves. He tried again and again. He kept on trying, and each time he jumped, the wolves would say, "You nearly got it." And when he fell onto the stones below, they would say, "Try again." At last the wolverine made a supreme effort, and succeeded. The whole cache came tumbling down onto the beach, and the wolves leapt on it and tore it to pieces. They ate everything. The wolverine was too tired to fight for his share. He found a corner in which to go to sleep, but the wolves were full of vim and vigor. When they saw the wolverine curling up, they said, "Hey, what's the matter?" And the wolverine replied, "Oh, nothing. I want to get up early, that's all." The next morning the wolverine was still asleep, and the wolves went over to the snowbank to poke him. "Hey, get up," they said, "time to go hunting." But the wolverine did not reply. He was dead. Sometimes I was able to persuade Lucy to tell me a story, interpreted of course by Ada, but her tales owed their interest to realism rather than to fantasy, and seemed to be laid in a setting more modern than that of Mary's tales, in which the birds and animals talked to man. I could feel how perilous life had been for unprotected women in the not-so-far-distant past. When Lucy was young, her mother had died, and she and her father had been left alone. Her chief recreation, it seemed, had been to go and sit with the old women of the village and listen to their tales of the bushmen, who waylaid unescorted women and carried them off to their secret lairs. I noticed, however, that in these stories the women always outwitted the ogre. "It was the custom in the olden days," said Lucy, for a young girl who was growing up to be separated from the tribe from time to time and required to live in a cabin of her own away from her parents' home. During this time she was in the care of her mother and must wear at all times a sort of large-brimmed hat which completely enveloped her. Her mother would bring food and push it under the brim of the hat. She did not even see her mother. After she had eaten, her mother went away. When it was time for the girl to be brought back to the settlement, her mother would go with a stick, push the end of it under the brim of the hat, and lead the girl home as one leads a blind person. Now there was a cunning old bushman living in the neighborhood, and he thought of an easy way to get himself a woman. He lay hidden and watched the mother's procedure, and then the next time the girl was living in Tissy Shun, as it was called, he waited for the appropriate time, and then played the part of the mother. He took the stick and pushed it under the brim of the hat. The girl supposed her mother had come to fetch her home, and so she took the end of the stick and began to follow the leader. But as they walked along, the brim of the hat lifted a little, and she saw a man's feet. She realized that she must think out a plan of escape. Ahead of them was a mountain which must be crossed, and as they reached the foot of this, the girl began to complain that she was tired and needed to rest. At last her captor let her sit on a stump, but he was too full of jubilation to sit still himself, so he tied her securely to the stump and went prancing up the mountain side to spy out the land. On top of the hill he danced about, saying, "Nana chichin kun ya-e," watch the country well, and he looked to the stump far below, where nothing could be seen but the hat. Nin-a-yin, the bushman, capered a little way down the far side of the mountain, and as soon as he was out of sight, the girl freed herself from the rope, whisked from under the hat, and leaving it draped over the stump, began to make her way under the cover of the trees towards her parents' home. The bushman returned to the top of the hill, and then came down to fetch his girl. He took the rope to lead her away, but found he had been fooled. His dance now turned to a caper of rage, and the girl saw him screaming with fury and frustration, but she herself in time reached home and was happily reunited with her parents. I found these stories much too interesting to keep to myself. I applied for a weekly quarter of an hour from CHAK, when I could broadcast my versions to the Delta's native stories for the benefit of the children. This became a regular feature on Tuesday evenings, and I tried to avoid missing a program, though I was sometimes reluctant to uproot myself from the warmth of my sitting room and make the long, cold walk to the studio. However, I was surprisingly rewarded by the appreciation of the Indian women who would stop me in the street and say, "We sure do like to hear our stories over the air." Eskimo stories were not so easily come by, as the older Eskimos did not speak English, but Edward Kikoak from Tuktoyaktuk, who was in hospital with a broken leg, told me an Eskimo story called The Little Clay Hunter. There was once an Eskimo village with two poor people living in it, an old woman and her grandson. The chief was fond of the old woman and her boy, and he sometimes gave them food. One day, when the boy was fast becoming a man, the chief told him it was time he became a hunter. "You had better go out hunting and have some adventures," he said, "so that you can tell us stories in the dark winter days." The boy was troubled about this. He had no stories to tell, and he had no meat to take home to his grandmother. He walked along, wondering how he could please the chief. He stooped down and picked up a lump of clay, and as he walked along, he kneaded the clay with his knuckles. Then he molded the clay, and the lump took shape under his fingers and became a little man, complete with bow and arrows. Just then the boy noticed the deer tracks lined the trail, so he set the little hunter down behind a bush to wait for a deer to pass, and went home. Early the next morning he went to find his friend, the little clay hunter. When he came to the place on the trail where the clay man was sitting, half hidden by a bush, he saw at once that the arrows were missing. "Where are your arrows?" he asked, and the clay man inclined his head towards the spot where two deer were lying across the path. Each pierced through the heart by an arrow. He pulled the arrows out and gave them back to the clay hunter, and then joyfully set off for home with the meat. The next day the adventure was repeated, and from then on, from time to time, he took home two deer to his grandmother, and so they both had lots of meat. The chief came and asked all sorts of questions about the hunting, but the orphan boy did not reveal his secret. Besides the deer which the clay man shot, the boy also killed a wolf and a wolverine, so he and his grandmother were rich now. By and by the village people heard about it, and the girls decided that the boy, who was no longer poor, would now make a good husband. So they visited him frequently and worked for him, and you would have thought that he would be happy now that he was so popular. But he did not care for any particular one of these girls. There was another girl in the village who was also an orphan, but the other girls saw to it that she did not visit the boy, whom they wanted for themselves. The old lady was very inquisitive about the hunting. She asked her grandson to tell her how it came about that he was so lucky. For a long time he resisted her curiosity and told her nothing about the little clay man. Then one day his resistance broke down, and he told her the secret of his hunting deer. The old lady decided she must see this magical little man for herself, so early the next morning she set off, following the well-worn trail. As she came within sight of the little man, he was just aiming his arrows. That night the grandmother never came home, and the boy was worried. He got up the next day and went out to look for her. He followed her tracks and came upon her body lying across the trail. Beside it was the body of a newly killed deer. The boy wept as he buried his grandmother there where she lay, and he reproached himself for telling her the story of the little clay hunter. He took his deer home. He was lonely now, and he had to do all his own work. The village girls came every night to see him, but when he was ready to marry, he took the orphan girl for his wife, and they lived happily there together. Chapter 17. Last Impressions. Education Week in the Mackenzie District was scheduled for the middle of February, and for days beforehand, Gloria and I were busy putting up samples of the children's work and rehearsing little items for the entertainment. The new superintendent of education was coming by plane from Ottawa and would stay in the town for 2 weeks, addressing teachers and parents' meetings and inspecting the work in the schools. Gloria had been working with her class on a dramatized version of the poem King John and the Abbot of Canterbury, and they had made some very effective costumes using the last of the surplus builders' materials to make shining armor. It was not until Friday afternoon that the inspector's plane arrived. He walked into school during the last scene of the play. He was a tall, slim, elegant-looking man, youthful in spite of his white hair, with a quiet voice and a pleasant taste in dress. This was just an introductory visit. The inspection would take place later on. When he said that on the next morning he was going to the coast to visit the little school at Tuktoyaktuk, the most northerly school in the Commonwealth, Gloria asked if I might accompany him. She herself had visited Tuk the previous year. The next morning, the little government plane set off, loaded with bags of mail. This was the first plane into Tuk since Christmas, and several passengers, the inspector, a government engineer from Fort Smith, to check up on the heating system and the condition of the school buildings, the Anglican missionary from Fort McPherson nursing a bouncing baby on its way home from the hospital at Aklavik to its Eskimo parents, and myself. As we climbed over Aklavik, we saw a wolf running across a lake. The plane flew for an hour or so, passing over the channels of the Delta area and towards the tree-encircled cluster of buildings at the Reindeer Depot. Then, leaving behind the timber, it crossed a low range of mountains, all glittering white, and came to the barrens, a treeless white expanse intersected by frozen channels. The pilot had not flown over this route before, and sat with a map spread out on his knee. He pointed out the occasional blemishes on the landscape, looking like white cupcakes standing on a dish. These were pingos, hills with cavities in the top, like extinct volcanoes, now filled with water. We passed Kitagazwit, a derelict army base, and could now see the sea, indistinguishable from the land as it was frozen over and covered with snow. The plane circled over 2 boats frozen into the harbor ice. The Fort Hearn, which brings Hudson's Bay Company supplies to Tuktuk by sea, and also a government meteorological research vessel, and swooped down to land in front of the settlement, where various people were waiting to meet us. The arrival of a plane was quite an event. The school was a cream-colored building containing a large, warm classroom, with sunshine flooding in through the windows and gleaming on the brown linoleum on the floor. It incorporated a cozy sitting room and bedroom, living quarters for the teacher. A signal had been sent from Aklavik the day beforehand, notifying the teacher of the superintendent's impending visit, and so, even though it was Saturday, the school was in session. The 16 Eskimo pupils of all ages were in their places, shyly covering their laughing faces with their hands. In this remote situation, a welfare teacher indeed lived up to her name. The school was the pivot of community life. All day, its amenities were devoted to the education and welfare of the young, and at night it was the meeting place of the native adults for gossip and games such as checkers, draughts, and cribbage. The teacher, it seemed, was always on call, ministering to the whole population in such extracurricular activities as the dispensing of drugs and first aid, the registering of births and deaths, the writing of letters for the illiterate, organizing the craftwork sessions, and the sale of native handicrafts, advising in matters of hygiene, and so on. It seemed to me to be a truly devoted work, unselfishly undertaken, with no hope of good times or exciting recreation out of school hours, and in fact no communication between plain arrivals with the outside world. While the superintendent was busy in school, I went to chat in the Hudson's Bay Company store. Arctic fox furs were hanging in the store, thick-furred, pure white pelts, and I bought 2 for $10 each. A couple of small boys, with round, rosy cheeks, clad in furs from head to foot, came to stand and gaze at me. They wore knee-high boots made of white fur, and I coveted a pair like them. An Eskimo woman in the store undertook to make them for me. The fur was taken from the inside of the legs of the reindeer, and the woman said I should have to wait until after the reindeer roundup in August before she could begin to make them. March went out like a lion. For 3 successive days a blizzard raged round Aklavik, a terrific wind driving powdered snow in furrows across the settlement. I spent a cozy Saturday afternoon with the BBC overseas program coming in at full strength, so that as I polished my floors and cooked my supper, I heard the broadcast of the university boat race and the international rugger match, and later Saturday night music hall. It seemed as if the English weather was as boisterous as Aklavik's. When I went to church the next morning, I found the town site traversed by walls of snow. I would cross a patch of almost bare ground where the snow had been blown off the surface, and then had to plow through the drift which spanned the hollow. For a while the crust was strong enough to support my weight, then suddenly I would plunge through and flounder about in the soft snow beneath, eventually managing to get a foothold with my knees and make my way out to the next bare patch. On Monday the wind abated, and the weather was much warmer, By the following weekend, the mercury had risen to 10 degrees, and for a brief period even touched 25 degrees Fahrenheit. The BBC reported that it was so hot in London that city workers had spent the lunch hour in the parks. The delight of the long hours of sunlight sent my spirits soaring, and I decided to take my class for an Easter picnic. I knew, of course, that it would not be like a picnic at home, when one picked wild daffodils or primroses, but at least the children could get some fresh air and play games in the snow. I invited them to bring mugs and sandwiches and told their parents they would be back by 6 o'clock. 20 children gathered at my house round 2 o'clock, the youngest only 5 years old, and we set off across the river, carrying with us a big pan in which to boil water for the tea. It took a long time to reach the first lake. The snow was scintillating with myriads of gems in all the colors of the spectrum, and underneath the bushes the tracks were thick of ptarmigan and mice and snowshoe rabbits and squirrels. We made a fire, put on it the pan filled with clean snow, and went to play hide-and-seek. There was no need to worry about getting wet in the powder-dry snow. When I went back to see if the water was boiling, I was astonished to find the fire burning at the bottom of a pit about 2 feet deep. As the snow round the flames had thawed, the fire had sunk deeper and deeper. In spite of the sunshine, the weather was cold, too cold, for instance, for us to take off our mitts when we ate our sandwiches. The temperature was just below zero. We retraced our tracks across the river and arrived home 2 hours earlier than I had anticipated, and the old-timers smiled. By the end of May, the sun was shining all round the 24 hours again, though the weather was still very cold. The ice moved on June 1st, as it had done the year before, and following it downriver came the host of birds. Roger's slow-motion clock had moved full circle. The woodland was again carpeted with pyrola, the banks of the channels lush with mare's tail, the puddles reflecting royal blue skies, golden with marsh marigolds. The difference was that this year I was free to enjoy it all. I took the children for nature walks. Their chief interest was in search for cranberries, and they were not very much excited about the birds' nests, since the eggs were too small to eat. As the trapping season ended, the husky boats came chugging upriver. The clusters of white tents dotted the river banks. The howling of dogs drenched the air. In school, we were much occupied with the setting and marking of the end-of-the-year examination papers, with counting attendances and checking the contents of store cupboards. Gloria was thrilled because on the first plane after school was out, she was going to return to civilization for her furlough. She had completed the first 2 years of her contract as a welfare teacher. The incoming planes were booked to capacity, bringing in surveyors and engineers and architects and construction crews for work in connection with house and road building projects. When I heard that the superintendent of education was coming in, although the schools were not in session, I wondered what his visit presaged. I soon found out. He brought shattering news for me. The government had decided to appoint a married man as principal of the Aklavik Day School. My house would be needed to accommodate him and his family, and I was to be transferred to the bigger school at Fort Smith, 1,400 miles south. My reaction was a feeling of frustration. What would become of my long-term plans for my pupils? By the time I got back to Aklavik, if ever, it might be too late to try to record the remains of the native culture. The storytellers were dying out, and the rising generation was acquiring only too rapidly the tastes and interest of the white man. I had 2 months' respite. However, the new principal was not coming in until September, and while Gloria was away, I should be responsible for all welfare duties. I could get in plenty of home visiting. The first incoming freight brought a spanking new boat for Bill Carson, the Hudson's Bay Company store manager, and he was soon organizing expeditions in it. Early in July, there were swimming parties in the channel on the other side of the river. We put on our bathing suits at home, pulling over them a pair of slacks and a shirt and a raincoat, and gathered on the river bank outside the store at about 7 o'clock in the evening. When all were assembled, we piled into the dazzling white speedboat and hummed across the river, cleaving a frothy V of foam into the blue water. We headed for the Pokiak Channel, where a half-sunken barge moored among the wild roses provided landing stage and diving board. There we leapt out and tied up the boat. The mosquitoes were already alerted, and there was only one way of escape, into the water. So, one after another, we dived in. It was difficult to believe that only a few weeks earlier the water had been covered by several feet of ice. Now it was no colder than that in any freshwater channel would have been. I found it refreshing and exhilarating as we disported ourselves. Little slant-eyed children from the surrounding tents came and sat along the top of the bank to watch us. After the swim, we climbed onto the raft for the last time, toweled ourselves briefly, and scrambled into the clothing which was our only defense against the enemy. Bill opened the throttle, and we sped for the open river, where at last we lost our pursuers. Then we went home to change, and over to the mission perhaps, to play bridge or drink coffee until midnight. During the first week in August, the young people rejoiced to hear that a big military plane was coming downriver on its annual tour of the North to inspect military bases. The whole town was out on the river bank to see it arrive. The machine was a Kanzo seaplane. It touched down a mile or so downriver, out of sight, round the bend, and the crowd waited with craning necks till at last it came floating along like some great bird out in midstream. Members of the crew appeared from trap-doors under the wings and catwalked out to the pontoons. where they stood with ropes waiting to make the machine fast. At last it was alongside the little dock, and the troops were pouring out of it. My first reaction was to set about organizing a dance. The school was filthy as it had not been cleaned since a movie show on a rainy evening, so I hurried off with an SOS to the administrator, and he authorized me to engage some women to clean it out the next day. I went to the bakehouse to order 12 dozen donuts, and to the signals office with a message to be broadcast to the settlement across the river, giving notice of the dance the next evening. On my way home, I ran into a bunch of the air crew and politely invited them to the dance, which would be held in the school tomorrow. "Tomorrow?" they exclaimed. "Why not tonight?" "Oh no," I said, "that's impossible." "Why? It's too short notice." "Why, for goodness sake?" "Well, for one thing, the school is too dirty." "We'll clean it," they replied promptly. "But I haven't enough mops." "We'll bring our own." It seemed they really meant it. "Well now," I said, "what shall we do about music?" And they told me they had 2 officers on board, one the doctor and the other the dentist, both of whom were dance band instrumentalists. They were sure that if I asked them, the 2 officers would combine to provide a dance band. So I handed over to them the key of the school and set off on another round of visits. First I called at the bakehouse and asked if the order for donuts could be brought forward to midnight that day. Then I went to CHAK with an announcement about the dance, and to the hospital with a special invitation to any of the nurses who might be off duty. Next, the band. I knocked rather diffidently at the door of the office where the doctor was at work, interviewing the military personnel in the settlement. "Come in," said a voice, and I entered. The doctor took the stethoscope from his patient's ribs and left him standing half-stripped while I put my proposition. Sure, he would come to the school just as soon as he had finished his work, say about 10:30 or 11 p.m. I thanked him and went over to the dentist's office. The dentist opened the door saying, come in," while his patient sat with his mouth wide open. Sure, he would come to the dance, and we'd whoop it up. When I got back to the school, I found fatigues in full swing. The floor was already swabbed and the polish going on in lumps. The electric polisher was on its way from the administration office. It only remained for me to organize from among the senior pupils a team of servers for the coffee and donuts. That night we all had a simple, righteous time. The 2 officers were first-rate performers, one a pianist and the other a clarinetist, and the native lads and lasses sat entranced while they played dance music in the modern style. The Air Force men, for their part, were equally delighted with the native fiddling, and the square dancing and the jig. They chased the pilot round the room, and carried him protesting onto the floor, insisting that he should give a performance of the jig, at which he made a very good attempt. The young nurses were much in demand as partners, and after the party was over, some of them came across to my house with their escorts. The pilot kept expressing his surprise at finding an English girl, that was the word he used, working in the Arctic, and he told us about the girl he had known in England during the war, who had taken him to her parents' home to dinner one night and impressed him with her grasp of world affairs. This rare expression of appreciation of the virtues of English women warmed my heart towards him. The Konzo dance was a fitting farewell party. It gave me a happy last memory of Aklavik. The day before I left, I went over to the hospital to say goodbye to my friends there. Mary took my hands between her wrinkled brown ones and looked up at me with tears in her eyes. She said something to me, and I looked across at Ada, waiting for the interpretation. She say, "Thank you for listening to the stories. She'll never forget you," said Ada. "And I shall never forget you," I replied. "Thank you for telling me the stories. I hope I shall come back one day to collect more."